This doesn't look like the sort of place a revolution might start, does it? Yet the woman who lived here changed the face of British politics.
When it comes to moral courage, women have just as much moral courage as some men have immoral courage.
Very strong views. She was very funny, and she had very quick wit. She was quite sharp, though. She rather enjoyed teasing people, and if they didn't stand up to her, she was pretty merciless sometimes.
This house, now the Naval and Military Club, was the London home of Nancy Astor. American-born and married to one of the world's richest men, she was more famous for her house parties than for her policies.
There were people who adored her, there were people who loathed her, there were others who admired her. She wasn't the kind of person that was flat or boring or dull, and you either took to her or you loathed her.
When the Astors moved here in 1912, the suffragettes were marching through London campaigning for the vote. Nancy Astor was no suffragette, yet she would become the first woman to take her seat in the British House of Commons. Her journey to wealth and Westminster began modestly, in a small house in Danville, Virginia.
She was born into this family in Virginia who had been a rather grand family and then lost everything in what she called the war between the states in America. And she was really born in poverty, and they made it back. And so she was very conscious of that all her life.
Nancy Astor arrived in England as a single mother after an early failed marriage. Quick-witted and sharp-tongued, she took Edwardian society by storm. In 1906, she married Waldorf Astor, whose family fortune had been made in the States.
When you lived with the English aristocracy, they never got familiar with you. You never got into a conversation with them. But with Lady Astor, her being an American, she was a totally different character altogether. She was interested in you and your family, and just the same as she was interested in public and all the people, and she was always talking about the common man.
Women in the United Kingdom finally secured a limited franchise in 1918. Some former suffragettes had stood as candidates in that year's general election. The only woman to win a seat, the Irish nationalist Countess Markievicz, had chosen not to take it.
Given sort of the efforts around suffrage, it might have been expected that the kind of women who would have been elected the first time would have been those very prominent women associated with suffrage. In a sense, perhaps it was kind of ironic that many of those early women were women associated with the Conservative Party and also associated with men who were already in Parliament, what we might term male equivalents. So in that sense, I think it was surprising.
This was true in Nancy's case. Waldorf Astor was an MP and a rising star of the Conservative Party. But in 1919, his father, Viscount Astor, died, and he was obliged to inherit the title and move to the House of Lords. A by-election was called in his constituency of Plymouth Sutton.
Lady Astor, with her husband, with a lovely home and 6 children, and Virginian born at that, what on earth put the idea into her head of going into politics?
Well, my husband put the idea in my head of going into politics. You see, he'd been a member of Plymouth for 10 years, and I'd fought all the elections with him and was devoted to Plymouth and understood as much about it as he did. And he had to go into the House of Lords when his father died. And his idea was two. First, that I should get in as the first woman, and the second, that I should get out if he could get rid of his peerage, which he hoped to do. Of course, he couldn't. And so I stood.
The by-election made her a star. In the campaign, she was supported by a young MP who in those days was a Conservative.
For my part, it was very, very simple. I simply had to stand up on a street corner, at which I'd already had a lot of practice, of course, and try and draw a crowd. When a sufficient crowd was drawn, I'd stand down and she'd speak, and then I'd get up again and ask them to thank her for show their support for her and that sort of thing. And so I had to take her all around Plymouth, the back streets of Plymouth, introducing her to the crowd. She's much better when she's interrupted, of course. She ought to have prayed for hecklers and interrupters, and she certainly got a lot. Now, a long, coherent speech of parliamentary character, not so good.
When the result was declared on November 28, 1919, Nancy had won by 5,000 votes. The new MP entered Parliament on December the 1st, a scene she later recreated on film, playing herself.
The house was crowded, and then Lloyd George on one side of her, Balfour on the other. Standing at the bar, a little mark on the floor, beyond which you mustn't come until the Speaker calls on you. And then the Speaker called on her, and she advanced with these two men by each side of her, with a little bow. I think she bowed and didn't curtsy. And then up to the table, I think you have to sign, if I remember rightly, something, and on to shake hands with the Speaker. There wasn't much comment either way. This completely new phenomenon, the shock of a woman appearing in this very male assembly.
I think it was very daunting because, you know, a lot of people, even in her own party, in the Conservative Party, were all horrified at the idea of a woman coming in, particularly one who was, you know, first of all born in America, a divorcee, you know, married to a peer. I mean, it broke every rule in the book. And I think she had quite a tough time.
Nobody wanted me there. It's like going into a man's club. I mean, who would want a woman in there? And I used to sit, once I sat for 5 hours without moving, because I was so terrified of walking out.
She knew nothing about the rules of procedure of a representative assembly. She certainly didn't bother about the rules in the House of Commons. She just said what she liked. And very often the Speaker had to rule her out of order, but she just went on talking. She sat on the, below the gangway, on the government side, and immediately beneath her, just below the corner seat, Churchill used to sit. Every time he got up to speak, she'd be interrupting him. And sometimes she seemed to be almost spitting at him, you know. She sat up behind him all the time, almost leaning on his shoulders, and he detested her. I don't know why there was such dislike.
He said, after 2 years, he's met me and he said, it's a very remarkable performance. It's a very remarkable performance. He said, I had no idea you could do it so well. I said, well, Winston, why didn't you speak to me? He said, I felt when you entered the House of Commons that a woman had entered my bathroom and I'd nothing to protect myself with except the sponge. Well, I said, well, did it never occur to you that your appalling appearance mightn't have been protection enough? I mean, that never occurred to him. It wouldn't occur to any man, would it?
She was a Christian Scientist, and so, you know, when I stayed with her, if you were ill, there was no question of going to the doctor. If you had flu, it was an hour's Bible reading or Mary Baker Eddy for an hour in the morning. You know, she had a cold bath every morning, or she swam in the sea if she was in Sandwich. So she was tough.
Nancy Astor was a woman of firm and fixed views. Anti-Catholic, anti-communist, not keen on divorce, despite the fact she divorced her first husband. Her maiden speech was on the perils of alcohol, a brave move for an MP representing a gin manufacturing port. She later brought in a bill to prevent the sale of alcohol to under-18s.
Weren't you a prohibitionist at one time?
Never. I was against having 8 public houses on one street. And that was all. I never was a prohibitionist, but I did believe in the control of drink, because I'd seen it, where a woman said to me at Plymouth, I can get my husband past 4 public houses, but I can't get him past 5 or 6 or 7 or 8. It was appalling.
She held her seat in 1923 and for the next 2 decades. Other women followed her to Westminster, although none of them made quite the same impression in the chamber.
I was up to the ears in the women's suffrage movement when you first got into Parliament, and I will not conceal from you that we, who didn't know you, we were disappointed. I mean, we thought we'd have a real old stager and somebody you know interested in or known as a social reformer. I can say this now because within a fortnight, you see, we adored you.
But I can truthfully say the loyalty of the women of England once I got into the House was past everything, and it made it possible for me to stay there.
She was someone who was prepared to use humour and who was not a wallflower and would hold her own and confront people who were critical of her presence in Parliament or the kind of issues she was concerned about. She rebelled against her government, for example. She wasn't a classic sort of backbench Conservative MP. She was quite prepared to stand against the leadership on particular issues, and she was also, in her attitude, sometimes closer to Labour members of the House of Commons.
We want people of imagination and vision and unselfish courage. And surely married women are just as apt to have that as married men. In fact, I sometimes think when it comes to moral courage, women have just as much moral courage as some men have immoral courage.
The Astors entertained on a grand scale at their many homes and mixed in a glittering crowd. But by the 1930s, their house parties were attracting unfavourable attention. At the time, the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, was pursuing a policy of appeasement towards Hitler, an approach which had wide support. Winston Churchill was one of the few to speak out against it. Reports started appearing in the press about an elite group intent on appeasement at any cost, meeting regularly at Cliveden, the Astors' country home. This so-called Cliveden set may have been a myth, but the stories tarnish Nancy Astor's image. When war did break out, she spent much time in Plymouth, which was devastated by the Blitz.
And she was terrific. She really rose to the occasion. They used to have dancing on the Hoe and she'd join in. I'm told she even did cartwheels, which I find difficult to believe, but I'm assured that she did. And she was there and she was for them.
But questions over her judgment remained. Her contributions in Parliament were missing their mark, and she was accused of criticising British troops, claims she denied. Nancy seemed to be losing her touch. Her husband sensed what she did not, and he decided she should stand down at the 1945 election.
I think the other important thing to remember is my grandfather was also very influential. I mean, she wasn't exactly the mouthpiece for him, but he was certainly the inspiration for a lot of her ideas.
Well, there, it's my husband. He wants me to get out. It's not my idea. It's almost breaking my heart. I'd rather go down fighting than retire.
Given her career, some might have thought she would be among the first women to join the Lords, when life peerages were first awarded in 1958, but she was not selected. She was awarded the freedom of the city of Plymouth in 1959. But to the end, she saw herself as something of an outsider.
I mean, she was always the American. You've got to remember that. I mean, when she was buried, she was at Cliveden. She was buried wrapped in a Confederate flag that had been given to her on her last trip to Danville, where she was born, where the last seat of the Confederate Parliament.
This large portrait depicting Nancy Astor's arrival at Westminster was presented to Parliament by her husband. The painting, measuring 12 feet by 8, was not well received. It was soon taken down and eventually found its way to Nancy's hometown, where it spent 21 years on a stairwell of the local newspaper office, the Danville Register and Bee. After lobbying by local historians, it is now on show on a more public stairwell in Danville City Hall. Parliament did accept this plaque from her family to mark her achievements. It now hangs close to Central Lobby. Nancy Astor, of course, had her own views on her legacy. At her memorial service, the former Bishop of Plymouth recalled her examining plans for rebuilding the city after the Second World War.
And she said, "I do hope they'll keep the city clean, morally and physically. When I die, I don't want any monuments, but I want litter bins scattered all over the city, marked, in memory of Lady Astor, keep the city clean."
Do you think, looking back, that women are as suited mentally to public life as men?
In many ways, I think they're more suited, because they're not so easily, they're not so easily flattered as men are. I guarantee any woman can get any man if she's got enough flattery.
A lot of men say women are emotionally rather sort of unstable and that their judgment, therefore, is a bit subjective.
I don't believe one word of that. And I know you can get any man, and I'll tell you how. Would you like to know? Tell me more about yourself.